Now I get to make a rebuttal, I think. I just want to say briefly just what a pleasure it is to be here with my friend Colin. As he mentioned, we go back a very long way. In fact, many late nights in Baghdad, and that gave us a certain capacity to understand what decay looks like and also what resilience looks like, and we'll probably be talking a little bit about both. But I also just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here with the Chicago Humanities Festival. Thank you all for coming on a gorgeous day to sit in the darkness with us. I am grateful for that. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my grandmother, my late grandmother, Carol Scherer, loved the Chicago Humanities Festival like nothing else. And she would be very pleased to know I was here today. So thank you for the invitation.
Great. So let's start with one of the things that Evan does in his books, he talks about the media and talks about how this kind of line of maybe dumbing down, let's say, the media has started, decades ago, and quotes some people who talk about, the average length of a report and all that. So despite that, I'm going to ask you to sum up in a few bullet points, what is Wildland about, and talk actually about the word Wildland, because I didn't even know that was a word before.
Yeah, thanks for that. And it is worth giving that particular detail on the dumbing down, because I found it pretty revealing in its own way that there's a study that was done of the average length of a soundbite, and in 1964 it was 62 seconds long. The average soundbite today on the evening news is 8 seconds. And I think you can extend that metaphor across so much of our attention economy and the way we think, and it has an impact on the shallows and the depths. And an occasion like this, of course, is a celebration of the depths, and that's one of the reasons why I think why we're all here. The idea for Wildland, the name turns out to be deceptive, because people, I think, imagine, quite rightly, and it's a perfectly logical interpretation, that I'm describing the United States as a wild place and a place that feels kind of out of control, and there's some truth in that. But actually, wildland is a very specific term, and it comes out of firefighting. It is the land that bursts into flame in a wildfire. So it is actually describing more of a condition than it is a specific location. It's the desiccated, overgrown, untended, deferred maintenance land that all it needs is that one spark to go up. And for me, American politics over the course of the last 40 years was becoming a wildland. It was on the brink of ignition in so many ways, and it was actually a little scrap of Chairman Mao's writing. Mao Zedong said that a single spark can start a prairie fire, and I spent all these years in China, and that concept stayed with me. And I suppose it's not a coincidence that the concept for this book and the title came to me while I was actually literally sitting near a prairie in southwestern Michigan, sort of staring off, trying to figure out how to make sense of this period in American politics. And then, of course, I called up my wife and I said, I have the title. And in that situation, a spouse really has no choice but to say, bravo, keep going. Because you can't say, I think you got to rethink, because then the writer is doomed. So,
right. They can say that.
Well, and I will say, I mean, if Sarah Beth was here, she would be very gracious in not pointing out all the moments in which she did steer me away from disaster, which is an essential part of the spouse responsibility in the writing arrangement. But in that, there are key moments. And editors, I don't know if you know any editors, Colin, but the editor's role is very often to just say, keep going.
Right.
Just keep at it. And then you can have that part of the conversation where you say, all right, this part is tripe, this part is cliche, this part is a disaster, but you've got a good sentence here at the bottom. But you can't do that in the beginning.
That's right. That's right. You got to get it out, get it down, and then you can start working with it. So you decided that once you had this title, once you had this kind of concept, right, you had decided to work or revisit 3 places, right?
Right.
as I was reading the book, I was thinking, had you stayed in touch with all three of those places, or was this kind of like a stepping back and saying, I'm going to do that? What was that process like?
Actually, curiously enough, I had stayed in touch with all of them. The one I was least in touch with was my hometown, Greenwich, Connecticut. For people who haven't read the book, I'll give you the short version, which is it's about 3 places in America where I've lived. And they are very different places. Chicago, where my family is from, and I worked at the Tribune for 9 years, raised from a cub by Colin McMahon. And Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is a small city in the northern part of the state. And I worked at a little paper there called the Clarksburg Exponent Telegram. It was my first job out of college, and I was a photographer, and quite a terrible photographer, actually. And they, I think they encouraged me to go into writing, and that's how this happened. And then the third place is Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a wealthy suburb of New York City. And we moved there when I was about 10 years old, and it was kind of an amazing place to be a kid, just a very fortunate place to be a kid. And I was there through high school. And it is also, in its own way, sort of the engine room of American capitalism. And if you focus on what's happening in Greenwich and what's not happening, what values are celebrated and which values are condemned, you might begin to get a sense of the shape of the American economic decision-making. And so these 3 places, and the one I was sort of, in its own way, most probably attenuated from, because I'd been coming back to Chicago constantly, and I'd been coming back to West Virginia a lot. I mean, curiously, I went to West Virginia with no particular history there, but after that experience of having worked there, it gets under your skin, and it's just a fascinating place. So I was always inventing reasons to go and report there. In fact, on September 11th, 2001, I was a Tribune correspondent in New York, I think maybe working for you? Like, were you the national editor?
No, I was in Moscow at the time.
So on that day, I had invented some cockamamie reason to go to West Virginia for a story. And I was on my way to West Virginia when the attacks of 9/11 happened. So I was in Washington on my way to Dulles Airport and turned around and came back and covered Washington, covered the attacks there. But I would find these reasons over the years for the New Yorker later to go and write about West Virginia. So that's how this idea, the title came later. I've been sort of, ever since I set foot back in the United States and realized the state of political extremis that we were in, really, the state of crisis, a kind of slow-moving avalanche, actually, that I realized I need to go back to these places I know. And that's right. What led me back.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the dirty secrets of being a correspondent is you do find these ways to invent stories that are in places where you want to go visit or haven't been to before. Yeah. Hey, I've never been there before. Let's find something there. Right?
This is how you end up with stories in the newspaper about things like the 6 most important new poets in Tuscany. You're always like...
Georgian winemakers was one of my favorite ones.
You did that like 4 times,
I did that like 4 times.
Exhaustive coverage of the Georgian wine industry, I'll note.
Okay, so when you came back...
Okay, it's time for a confession. I do think I did a story or 2 in the winter months in Beijing where I would say, we've got to address some of the Southeast Asian developments. The beaches are eroding at a desperate pace, Colin.
I think that was well-deserved. So you did come back, and one of the things that struck me in the book is you have a line something like... when you came back and kind of lived it a little bit in the United States, you asked yourself whether you had been lying to the people you had been talking to in other countries. Talk about that.
Well, I'd spent these years abroad in places places like China, Iraq, Egypt. I was reporting a lot in Myanmar and Syria and countries that were in one stage of either authoritarianism or collapse of one kind or another. And I often found myself making a case to people in conversation, not on the page, but in my encounters with people, to place a bet on the United States. I was basically telling people in some subtle way, particularly because these were the years after the invasion of Iraq, when we were, as a country, rapidly losing credibility in the eyes of the world, to be honest. And I found myself saying to people, look, we make mistakes, grave mistakes, and we always have, and it goes back to the very beginning of the country. And yet at the same time, I think we're oriented in the direction of some big ideas that are worth valorizing, like the rule of law or the pursuit of it, and the pursuit of truth, a belief at least in truth. And the third one was the idea of the right to pursue a better way of life. And I would always bracket it by saying, I need to point out we fall short of these aspirations all the time, but it is worth recognizing that at least we're facing in that direction. And when I came back to the US in 2013, just on the pure numerical level, it was pretty obvious that we were failing those promises. I mean, on the question of the right to pursue a better way of life, in 1940, if you were born in the United States that year, you stood a 90% chance of out-earning your parents. By the beginning years of this century, that number had dropped below 50%. And to point out, most of these positive measurements of American achievement in the post-war years applied to white, straight men. And so if you take that as the starting point and then you acknowledge that we have fallen away in so many other things, that's how you get to the point where I came back and said, okay, we're clearly falling so desperately short on these measures. And I will tell you, on the rule of law, the moment that drove it home for me was that I had spent years in China in a kind of golden age of Chinese corruption. I was there during a period when Chinese corruption was just spectacular. There were, like, you would run into a low-level municipal clerk who had bought 100 apartments and was kind of celebrated on the Chinese internet as Mr. Apartment because he owned 100 apartments. And I would be asked by friends in China, do you have this in the U.S.? And I would say, well, not that. We have rule of law. We have public officials are kind of kept from this kind of outright thievery. And I'm suddenly self-conscious of talking about this in Chicago. But but then I came back, and the first thing that happened was the governor of Virginia was indicted for just an absolutely heroic set of corrupt acts. He'd taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from a political patron, rides in a sports car, weekends at the country house, and so on. And he was eventually convicted, and then the conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court in a way that legal scholars will tell you has really undone a lot of the ability to hold people accountable for public corruption. I mention all of this to say I realized in that moment I think I might have been lying to people around the world, and I might have been lying to myself. And so this project was really an effort to go out and say, was I just desperately wrong about the way I was characterizing this country, or even wrong on a level that I need to acknowledge to myself? That's what this was about.
Don't answer that yet. Let's get back to that later.
An Agatha Christie approach. Leave it until the end.
That's right.
It was Colonel Mustard in the drawing room with the lead pipe.
So all that goes. So there's a lot of themes in this. I think the nationalization of politics is a fascinating topic. I want to talk about that. The kind of individualism, this exaltation of the individual, and which is farcical in many ways, because these individuals who are saying they did it all by themselves are doing it, of course, with the federal government in their back. And then some of the politics that we'll talk about too. And I think we used to have a dinner party game in which we would set a stopwatch. How long could we go without talking about the President of the United States? And so I did not say the man's name and will not until later in the conversation. So we'll obviously get back to that as well.
Joseph Robinette Biden, I think is who you mean.
But Biden, that's right. But first, talk a little bit about this individualism. I do want to read something, if I might. So, so this is in the chapter "You People." During my years abroad, I had written about rising individualism in modern China, where greater faith in the individual had developed partly from the distrust of political parties, corporations, and other powerful institutions. In the United States, I come upon an even starker version of that trend. A hyper-individualism that rested on fantasies of self-reliance and a cult of winning and losing. It was the crescent idea that had been growing for decades. In a digital analysis of American books over the past 2 centuries, the Harvard scholar Robert Putnam and his co-author, Shaylin Romney Garrett, found a steady decline beginning around 1970 in references to agreement unity and compromise. I thought that really kind of captured that theme.
Yeah. I was really blown away by this. I mean, there is a way in which and it's useful actually to situate it as you did in the context of China, because I'd been coming from a place in which China had been, in a sense, the pendulum had swung so far in the direction of downplaying the individual that they had found themselves in trouble. And, that reached its sort of apex during the Cultural Revolution. And just to remind ourselves, at that point they actually got rid of the rank insignia on military uniforms because they wanted to de-emphasize how much distinction there was between people and rank and class. And then and so that was creeping back into Chinese society in the years I was there, and that was one of the things I was describing. And then I came to the United States and discovered actually that our mythology, our self-narrative about individualism had taken on these kind of mutant forms, that they had become self-justifying and in their own way sort of a cartoon of American individualism. And there's a wonderful, I mentioned Robert Putnam in there because he has an elegant way of framing it, which is he says, we tend to valorize the single horseman on a hill, the Marlboro Man kind of looking out over the frontier. That's our dominant emblem when we imagine our history. But of course, the reality was that guy would have died without the wagon train, without the group of mutual-minded people who were there, including women and children, who were there to actually form a coherent, functioning community. And we tack back and forth throughout American history between acknowledging the wagon train and not acknowledging the wagon train, and not sort of imagining that that's who we are. And that we had reached this period, I think particularly, and this ties into some of the more extractive forms of capitalism, that really just regarded that individual on the hill, I built this entirely my own, this is all of my own making, as a particularly pernicious ideological current that was driving a lot of what happened here. And you did a nice job before of sort of not mentioning the former president. I think it's worth sort of recognizing that one of the entire subtexts of this book is essentially explaining how that happened. That guy didn't come out of nowhere. That guy was the product of these building forces, essentially this sort of accumulating fuel on the land. And when he came around, it was ready to burn.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about how the folks in Greenwich were helping lay that situation, make that situation available for him.
Yeah, in Greenwich is an interesting place to look at economic thinking and also establishment thinking as a way of sort of understanding how American power moves. It is literally the hometown of the Bush family. George H.W. Bush grew up there. His father, Prescott, was a local mucky-muck and eventually the senator from Connecticut. And he was sort of the ideal local politician. And in a way, what they represented at the time was this kind of what they would describe as sort of a moderate republicanism. I mean, this was, Prescott Bush, George H.W. Bush's father, believed in things like if you are born with great advantage or you accumulate great advantage in life, you need to spend more in your taxes in order to help ensure that we have a functioning system. And he's on record as having sort of challenged his party and said, hey, we need to spend on things like education and welfare state and research and development. I'm not overstating, I'm not sort of lionizing him, but I'm just drawing a distinction between what he was saying then and what some of the things that happened later. I want to give you just one example of how things changed. In 2013, a guy from Greenwich ran for governor of the state of Connecticut. He was a private equity executive named Thomas Foley, and he'd done well. He had a yacht and a collection of cars and 2 British fighter jets, and he lived in a house that the local paper compared to the Hogwarts castle. And when he produced his tax returns for reporters, it showed that he'd paid $673 in federal taxes the previous year. This is 3 years before Donald Trump was elected president. And in a way, what was remarkable about it was that it wasn't a huge story at the time. It was just sort of, well, that was $673 in taxes. And he had claimed so many investment losses and alimony payments that he had sort of come up with that number. And I remember looking at that and just thinking, how do we expect to have a viable, coherent, durable American state if that's the norm, if that's considered okay? And in his mind, of course, that was a perfectly legitimate use of the law. And one of the themes that runs through this book is that every time you hear somebody say, well, I'm just doing what the law allows, we should all repeat like a mantra, but how did the law become the law?
Right. That's right. Yeah, the line in that is people often defended their avoidance of even reasonable taxes by saying they were just doing what the law allowed. But it was an explanation that plainly ignored how the law came to be what it was. The efforts and fortune expended to write it for their own maximal benefit.
And that's a very specific thing, too, that we have to identify. In the years between 2001 and 2013, when I moved to Washington, in that decade-plus period, the amount of money that was coming into Washington, D.C. in lobbying, public relations, and other forms of essentially influence peddling more than tripled. It's worth saying that again. It more than tripled in that 10-plus year period. And so the Washington that I walk into in 2013 was opulent. I mean, it had actually literally just surpassed Silicon Valley as the wealthiest metropolitan area in the country.
Wow.
And what's fascinating about it was this is just 5 years after the financial crisis. And the political capital of the United States has become the wealthiest place in America. Something is desperately wrong. I mean, it was kind of on the level, you could actually feel it almost on a very basic level. There was too much money sloshing around Washington. You could just tell. And it wasn't coming from nowhere, to adapt a local phrase.
Yeah, I think I might have been unfair when I said this wasn't fun, but it's fun in like a weird way, right? But there's a lot of statistics in this book, and they're very compelling. But one of the ones
they're sort of fun, actually.
Some of them are, including like how many bathrooms can you possibly need in a house? Those kinds of statistics. Or why 2 fighter jets?
Well, that's if you have to ask, Colin.
That's right. You quote an observer, Harrington. I don't know who he is or she, but
she's a professor who studies wealth and taxes.
Yeah, so she says, the underlying massive change is that wealth no longer needs to justify itself. It is self-justifying. I look back and I think that's when we gave up on being a we.
I have to say I was really pleased when the description for this event was politics and culture, because that gets to the culture piece of it. And I think oftentimes we don't talk enough about culture as a constituent, as an ingredient in our politics, because that's really what she's describing there, I think quite well, is how we imagine ourselves relating to one another, and what is okay and what is not okay, and what is considered out of bounds, and what's the kind of thing that will get you kicked out of the country club.
Yeah, and I think that even in the prologue, you kind of set that up as, the question for the country is whose life matters, right? I think is something like that.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I think of that as essentially the core referendum on a political society is whose life matters. And, that in our country, that language now has a specific power to it. But one could also apply that principle to other places where you and I have worked. I mean, the definition of who is considered legitimate or illegitimate on the basis of religion or ethnic origin or location or any of those things is very often one of the deciding factors in whether a place is durable and functional or not.
Yeah, so let's get to the politics a little bit. So one line of inquiry in the book is the money, obviously, and how the money is corrupting the political process, but particularly how people with a lot of money behind the scenes made an effort to identify Republicans who would carry out their wishes and could get enough votes to get elected, right? And so how that money changed the Republican Party in particular, I thought was fascinating, and maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's sort of the dominant fact of our time, and in a way, I don't want to name names, but let's just say there's somebody whose name rhymes with Mitch McConnell. And in some ways, he is the ultimate expression of some of the phenomena we're describing about. Because Mitch McConnell is not somebody who believes that he is doing something in his mind that is doing violence to democracy. What he believes he is doing is winning.
Right.
And in a way, I ended up returning to this concept a lot at the sort of the idea of winning at all costs is the preamble, the sort of moral preamble to Trumpism. Because, Trump, doesn't really stand for anything beyond the idea that winning is all that's what he believes fundamentally, is that winning is what matters. And what you saw happening in the years before he was the nominee was the idea that became acceptable. I mean, just to give you one example, I came to Washington. My first day working in Washington was October 1st, 2013, which was the day the government shut down. And it was the first time in 17 years the government had shut down. And it was a very strange way to come to Washington. I mean, I do what you do when you get to a new posting. I called up the White House to get my press credentials, and I got voicemail because they said, we're sorry, but due to the government shutdown, we're unable to take your call. I was like, what kind of banana republic have I come home to? And I went over to Capitol Hill. This is one of those moments that as a sort of foreign correspondent by training, your instinct is actually to just sort of get up and walk outside and go talk to people.
That's right.
And so I go over to Capitol Hill and I meet these tourists from Finland who were standing outside the Capitol, sort of looking up at it and trying to understand why it was that they couldn't go inside, why our government had shut down. And they asked me in a very earnest way, they said, I remember it was Timur Engblom, I remember his name. He said, does this happen very often in your system? And he said, and he was very polite about it. He did not want to be judgy. And he was saying, when will it reopen? And they had their suitcases. They were like, and I just felt like I was in this completely preposterous position. I was like, well, it will reopen. We have no idea when it will reopen, actually, to be precise. And then I found myself sort of explaining. I was like, well, Ted Cruz, you have to understand, Ted Cruz. And then I was listening to the words come out of my mouth. And I mentioned in the book that government shutdown, which ended up lasting for, I think, 18 days, cost the United States $24 billion, which is enough money to send a rover to Mars and back 8 times. And when people wonder, how did the United States sort of lose some of the speed off its fastball against places like China? It's useful to look at moments like that. And you don't want to know who benefited from that government shutdown. Ted Cruz ended up causing to be written, a children's coloring book about himself. Please look this up. It's the best thing in my book. Ted Cruz had a children's coloring book called something like Ted Cruz Goes to Washington, and it became the single highest selling children's coloring book on Amazon for 6 months after the shutdown. If that doesn't make you want to climb into a hole and just pull something over the top, I don't know what does. But I remember thinking about this, and the reason why I kind of gravitate to some of these slightly, really on the edge of absurd details is because in Washington, that kind of stuff is slightly shrugged off as sort of, well, that's just, it's, ever thus. There's always been vanities and there's always been abuses of power, and you're almost sort of, it's a little bit naive to be talking about it. And I kind of was, partly because I wasn't coming from Washington, I sort of was looking around and be like, this is not, and it wasn't ever thus. It's gotten worse. And you have to sort of acknowledge that things have gotten worse in order to be able to address where we went wrong.
Yeah, so I think that we used to always talk about you need to cover Washington like a foreign correspondent would cover Washington, right? And you had that, and I don't know if you still feel like you have it, but you had that opportunity and that rhythm and that insight when you came back.
I do think coming back from being overseas is helpful because you do regard it with a little bit of strangeness. And there is a wonderful tradition of this. I mentioned in Wildland the history of a great Chicagoan named John Gunther, who covered Europe, the Pacific, came back to the U.S. in the 40s, and decided to write a book about the United States because, as he said at the time, I feel a little bit like a man from Mars. And that's how I felt a little bit. I remember the moment where I was sitting in an Amtrak station, and they started playing a public service announcement about what to do in the event of a mass shooting. And I have to say, I mean, there's nothing funny about this in the slightest. It is so grim, but it has to be recognized about how strange and unique that is. And I sort of was looking around the seating area as they're saying things like, if there is an active shooter, you should pick up your suitcase and throw it or move away. And I was thinking to myself, we are the only advanced country that has this issue. We obviously, as we all know, we have the highest per capita gun ownership in the world. The second closest is Yemen, and they're way behind us. And it was one of those moments that I had to look around and say, how did this become normal? How did this become the kind of thing that we don't get up every day and run around with our arms in the air shouting? And I spent a lot of time returning to that, as you know, in the book, because I sort of think of that as one of those frog in the boiling water moments that a sort of poisonous adaptation.
Yeah. So if anybody was keeping score, it's 4:34 that Trump's name was mentioned. So 34 minutes, not a new world record, but not a bad performance by Osnos McMahon. So I'll dig right in. So the story of Trump's rise, and this is what you were getting to earlier, the story of Trump's rise was often told as a hostile takeover. Oh, I love this line. In truth, it was something closer to a joint venture in which members of America's elite accepted the terms of Trumpism as the price of power. Long before anyone imagined that Trump might become president, a generation of unwitting patrons had paved the way for him. From Greenwich and places like it, they launched a set of financial, philanthropic, and political projects that changed American ideas about government, taxes, and the legitimacy of the liberal state. In every element of his commercial and political persons, Trump was a consummation of that project. He stood for a liberation from restraint and a willingness to go to war for that liberation. He was contemptuous of political correctness, dismissive of climate change, and scornful of sacrifice. He lampooned prisoners of war. Most of all, of course, he stood for a belief in unbridled self-enrichment. And on that basis, some of his more genteel supporters were willing to overlook the rest. As Mitch McConnell had said of himself, they wanted to win. So you build the book up to that point and come back to that point, looking at the mining industry in West Virginia as a perfect example.
Yeah.
Was there something there that in West Virginia that you didn't anticipate? Was it worse than you thought? What was that like?
I'll tell you a fascinating detail that I actually think is kind of. I only devoted a couple of sentences to it in the book. It's actually a huge fact, which is that the city in West Virginia where I lived, Clarksburg, was a proud place. I mean, there in the decades after World War II, it was doing pretty well. It had these glass factories that were delivering pretty reliable employment. It was there was literally a billboard that hung in town that said, "You have a right to be proud." I mean, per capita income was doubling at the pace it was in other parts of the country. And for a long time, West Virginia was all Democrats. Really back to FDR. FDR during the Great Depression had brought relief programs to West Virginia, and they had rewarded him with allegiance to the Democratic Party that lasted for decades. In fact, it was sort of complete. When I came as a journalist in 1999, it was the entire congressional delegation was Democrats, and the state house was run by Democrats, and so on. And then it flipped. It's been the most abrupt transformation in American politics of any state, to the point that today, with the exception of Joe Manchin, the entire congressional delegation is Republicans, the state house is in Republican hands, and it's one of the more sort of reliable pieces of Republican territory. I was fascinated by that transformation, and we can talk about that, but I think there's one detail that is worth mentioning, which is that in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, he went to Clarksburg, West Virginia. Jackie Kennedy went to Clarksburg, West Virginia. Bobby Kennedy went. Teddy Kennedy went. Hubert Humphrey went. Lyndon Johnson went. It was on the political radar. And there's nothing specific about Clarksburg. I mean, they were all over West Virginia. There was a way in which the political map encompassed places like that. And Jack Kennedy, in fact, went on local television in little tiny Clarksburg, West Virginia, population 16,000, and he answered questions for a half an hour from people on local TV. So there was a degree of connection that people had with Kennedy and ultimately with the Democratic Party. And in the decades after that, for all the reasons that we know, but for sort of larger structural reasons, West Virginia became a lot less important to the Democratic Party, ultimately because of concentration in cities. This is where the votes were. And I remember asking the Historical Society, I know the folks over there, I said, can you figure out which other Democratic presidential candidates have come to Clarksburg since 1960? And they came back finally and said, well, we found that Jesse Jackson went once, and that was it.
Wow.
So from 1960, and when Trump came to West Virginia, he lied to people, fundamentally. He put on a miner's helmet and he said, I'm going to put you back to work. In fact, he said, you're going to be working your asses off. And coal miners said, I remember talking to a guy named David Efa, a coal miner near Clarksburg, and I said, did you believe him? And he said, no, I didn't believe him, but he was the only one who showed up. He was the only one who was listening. And I voted for him. And I took a lesson from that, which is not that West Virginia voted for Republicans simply because Democrats stopped showing up, but because there was a way in which there was a feeling on the part of people in West Virginia that the Democratic Party no longer had a place for them. And that's something I don't think we actually talk about kind of enough. And it's worth recognizing.
Yeah, so stay with that a little bit. So how does then the Democratic Party attack that problem? And one of the things that I think, you talk a lot about race in this book, and you kind of, one of the passages in here is Evan's reporting on white supremacist movements, and there's some really gripping stuff in there about that. At the same time, there's a lot of people who are who think that the people who went for Trump motivated largely by racism, right?
Yeah.
And so how does the Democratic Party connect with these people if they are if that's a large part of their motivation?
Well, I think the answer is, part of the answer is yes, there are people who voted for Donald Trump because he was saying racist things and they liked that. And we have to acknowledge that and say that. I think that's very important. And look, the truth is, in West Virginia, there are folks who feel that way, very clearly. But then there's this other group of people who are more in play politically than we sometimes assume. One of the sort of thrilling things I encountered, I describe in the book this coalition called West Virginia Can't Wait, which is really kind of an interesting group of people. They're basically young Democrats, progressives, but they don't use that word because they know it's poisoned in West Virginia. So they're calling for very progressive things. They're calling for a much greater provision of health care. They're calling for exactly the kind of things that progressive Democrats want. But what they're running against is what they call the good old boys club in West Virginia. They don't want to be, they know that there is, what they're essentially acknowledging is, to go back to something we talked about earlier, which is the culture piece of this, which is that they know that the culture, the political culture in West Virginia has been poisoned to the idea of what the Democratic Party can do, and so they're sort of doing an end run around it. But they're actually achieving something. They are beginning to get votes, partly because the young cohort in West Virginia is much more inclusive, is much more prepared for a modern state and a more diverse country. And you have to figure out a way to pick the lock to allow them to describe themselves as Democrats. But one of the things that somebody said to me at one point there was a progressive activist named Katie Lauer. She said, after the 2020 election, she read a tweet in which somebody said, I hope everybody, after Trump lost, she read a tweet that said, I hope everybody at the Cracker Barrel is crying. And she said, why do we want anybody crying right now? How is that going to advance our aims? And she is a very successful and emphatic labor activist, environmental activist, and her point was we should be figuring out how to bring people in if we're going to try to change the system, because we have to change it from the inside. And I took a learning from that, which is that it's a mistake to say we are writing off a place like West Virginia forever, because the fact that it turned from blue to red as fast as it did gives you a sign that there is something that's more in play there than we might assume. And I'll just give you one last fact on that, which is in the 2016 presidential election, in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders won all 55 counties in the state of West Virginia, which is extraordinary if you think about it. Now, that is a sign that there is an appetite there for a more challenging, disruptive politics than we might assume, and it's not all that everybody is permanently in the Trump grip.
So when Joe Biden talks about, reaching out to across the aisle and more unity and getting people like the ones that Katie's talking about, right? He's criticized as being naive. So where is it, right? Where do you go? How do you put that together?
Well, we'll discover pretty soon if he's naive, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, he may well be. I mean, this is the honest answer. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about Joe Biden, trying to understand how his mind works. And, if you take a case like his relationship with Joe Manchin, part of what in some ways the most important conversations in Washington, D.C. right now are between two Catholic guys named Joe in their 70s. And it's like, that's the ball game right there. And that's the kind of expression they would use, I suppose, too.
Right, that's right.
But what Biden basically is trying to do with Manchin is I know this, he will never say to Manchin, you're voting against your own interest. He will not use the kind of things that we often say when we're trying to explain to ourselves how it is that people are doing this to themselves in West Virginia. What he tries to do is say, think about this other way of assessing your own interest and interpreting it. And look, I'm not here to try to explain Joe Manchin's chemistry, but I think there's a degree to which, look, he takes money from oil and gas. He's going to do things that they want him to do. He is a guy who spent his career in the coal business. But fundamentally, he is persuadable. And we will see over the course of the next, literally week or two. But I think this question, from the very beginning, the Joe Biden presidency has been predicated on a pretty big bet, which is that he can assemble these coalitions. The fact that he was able to get the bipartisan infrastructure deal, at least to the point that it is now, already was a little bit of a rebuttal to some of the conventional wisdom in Washington. It all may come to tears, but if it doesn't, it will force us to at least imagine that it may be more possible to pick the lock than we sometimes assume.
And as you point out, the hurdle is that the Democrats and the Republicans are in a kind of asymmetrical warfare, right?
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, they're in an asymmetrical warfare partly because Democratic Party is seeking to make change, and fundamentally the Republican Party right now is seeking to maintain the status quo. So all they have to do is prevent action, stymie action, obstruct movement of government, and that constitutes success. So there is just fundamentally that asymmetry. But then there's another fact, which I'll be blunt about, which is that the Republican Party right now will more or less do anything at the top ranks. This is not an extravagant statement. The idea that, is there anything that Kevin McCarthy would not sign on to right now? I challenge you to name it. So that's part of it. But I think the way that this ties in to what I've been thinking about for all of these years is that this is the product of this march towards this moment, in effect. And the reason why I think it is worth recognizing is that what Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and these guys represent is a sort of profound cynicism, a sort of complete and total cynicism about what politics can be, which is that in the end, it need not be this, an act of inspiration, that it should fundamentally about maintaining and winning. And there are a lot of people, frankly, the kinds of folks who would come to a discussion of this kind on a Saturday afternoon, who don't believe that, and who believe that actually politics really can be an instrument for human flourishing, and that we can, in fact, use these things for the benefit of people who are vulnerable. And you saw that in 2020. You had record turnout, not only overall, but also from populations that don't usually turn out, young people, communities of color that were coming out in much larger numbers. That is just a it's sort of a proof of concept that for a guy, Joe Biden, I'm going to make a revelation here, is not the most thrilling presidential candidate, but people came out for him because of the promise that he was holding out, which was, mostly getting rid of Donald Trump, but it was also a rejection of that idea. And I have to say, I tend to be, I think, a little bit earnest about politics, and almost to the point of being a bit, I think, it can seem naive in Washington to even announce the possibility that you think politics could be steered towards something beyond personal ambition. But I absolutely believe that, and I think there are a lot of Americans who believe that. So, that's my Ted Lasso moment for the day.
That's right. That's nice. And stalemate as victory, right? Stalemate as victory. You're going to be tired of all the stalemate, right?
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. Right. I have to say I do take some small pleasure in having worked 8 years in Washington and never attended a White House press briefing. I think that
that's great. So you talked about one thing that didn't occur to me. And so what I like about this is this book, everybody, is that there's, even if you really are following things, even if you really are keeping up, you forgot some things. There are things in here like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And you're thinking, how could I forget about that, right? But you forgot about it. And then it brings it back in, and then there's some insight about how it connects to what's going on today. So there's a lot of that. But there are a couple of things where you're like, yeah, wow, I hadn't thought of that. And can you just talk quickly about this idea, and I want to know how much you subscribe to it, that some of the QAnon stuff, some of the Trump stuff, some of the, I'm going to fight, comes out of needing something to do or needing something to make you passionate about this boredom, right?
Yeah.
And talk about it in America, and then your comparison to what it was like in China.
Well, there is this kind of really interesting body of research that's developing now among scholars who look at the way that ideas move online, and particularly things like anger, what I call fury. How does that happen? Where does it germinate? How does it move? What are the sort of the vectors? And one of the things they've identified is something that was predicted, actually. Francis Fukuyama, who often usually gets kind of dismissed for having the shorthand is that he declared the end of history. The truth is, actually, he had a couple of really important insights about the world to come. And one of the things that he predicted was that if democracy becomes essentially perceived as an established fact, an unchallenged fact, then people will eventually begin to rage against it. And he described that as a kind of boredom. It's not boredom about the absence of stimulation. It's not, that kind of boredom. It's something deeper. It's almost like a kind of intellectual boredom, a way in which people suddenly found themselves deprived of a natural enemy and looked for a way to looked for a force to fight against. And eventually that force became democracy itself. And what I find fascinating in this research is that there is a body of people out there who have found purpose online in a kind of a sort of nihilism, in which there is no point other than to burn it down. There are people who answer surveys, and the question is, are you doing this because you believe in the cause? Are you doing this to burn it down? And they're like, oh, burn it down. and there's actually there was a paper that was very celebrated in political science a couple years ago that established this group of people. And I think the reason why I mention this and the reason why I linger on it in the book is that you see it. Once you know it exists, it comes up over and over again because we see that it sort of attaches to things. And so it's part of the impulse behind, it's part of the impulse behind the January 6th insurrection was this, in a sense, kind of free-form political energy that is born of enemy and despair and ultimately attaches to whatever kind of dark charisma is available. And in this case, that was Donald Trump and the lie, the big lie. So, I was there on January 6th. There's a reporter for The New Yorker, and I remember encountering people and thinking to myself, this is the product of a process that began not just on 9/11, but really does go back to the end of the Cold War, and we were kind of unfastened from some of our beliefs and let loose.
Yeah, and then that's terrifying, first of all. And secondly, has January 6th changed that for people? Did it change it in Greenwich even?
No. I mean, I have to say, this is one thing I thought when I was doing the reporting after January 6th, I remember calling up folks in Greenwich who'd voted for Trump, and I talk about this in the book, that I expected a few of them to say, well, he lost me there. I'm done with this guy. And to a person, none of them said that. And that I found chilling, actually, because I don't want to send people out of here in despair this afternoon. But I want us to go out of here with a sense of urgency and a sense that the situation is not solved by ejecting Donald Trump from office. And you know this, but it's worth pointing out, here we are 8 months later, and the problem is metastasizing and needs to be described as such. And it's because it is deeper than just him. It goes to these underlying issues of how we organize our politics, our economic lives, our culture, how we think of ourselves as sharing a political society. And there's a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, it's a feature, not a bug, right? It's a plan. It's not an accident.
Yeah. So I come out of this project, I have to say, feeling like that what this project is about defining the problem. I will lean on Albert Einstein for a moment, who said, if you give him an hour to talk about a problem, he will spend 55 minutes trying to describe it and 5 minutes giving you his suggested solutions. We're out of time, so we're not going to do the 5 minutes. But actually, in all seriousness, that's part of the reason why I sort of wanted to document what I think of as the problem, because otherwise I don't think we understand how to begin to solve it.
We are out of time, but I'm going to keep Evan for 1 minute, and he confided to me that he needs to take a break from books. We'll see. I don't know how long that'll last, but what is next for you?
Well, I sort of want to, I want to focus on my New Yorker work. It's a wonderful institution. Feel free to subscribe. But I sort of want to write about excellence, actually, for a little while. I want to write about some examples of success, and there's something a little intellectually dishonest about that, because what I'm saying is, I want to go to places and just find the successful examples and show me the numerator but not the denominator. But I kind of want to do that because I've been spending some time marinating in some of the trouble, and
right.
Don't let this cheerful exterior deceive you.
Tuscany has a lot of excellence.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that because the beach erosion in Thailand is alarming.
So, Evan, thank you very much. Terrific book. Appreciate your time here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.